History is filled with battles where steel and courage shaped the fate of nations. But every now and then, a moment arrives that defies every rule of war. A moment where the weakest warrior becomes unstoppable, where numbers mean nothing, and where a king already dying becomes the sharpest blade on the battlefield. What you're about to hear is not just the account of a forgotten clash in the desert. It is the story of a young monarch fighting against his own body, of an army smaller than a village standing against a nation, and of a victory so stunning that even the chroniclers of the era tried to bury the truth. Now, step into the heat of the Levant, where a 21-year-old king would change the art of war forever. His fingers had already rotted away. Baldwin IV, young king of Jerusalem, could hardly hold a sword, the disease consuming him faster than any enemy ever could. Yet on a blazing morning in 1182, this dying ruler would take command of just 750 knights and march straight toward an army that looked as endless as the desert itself. 30,000 of the finest warriors in Saladin's empire, stretching across the horizon like a living tide. When Saladin's scouts reported the tiny Crusader column, they mocked it. 750 knights charging against a force 40 times their size? Madness. A hopeless gesture. An invitation to die. But before the sun set, 2,000 Muslim warriors would lie motionless on the field, and the Crusader host, impossibly, would remain unbroken, emerging from the clash exactly as they had entered it, intact, defiant, and victorious. For centuries, three questions have tormented historians. How did an army so pathetically outmatched not only survive, but win? What battlefield innovation suddenly turned Crusader infantry into an impenetrable wall against some of the greatest horse archers ever known? And why did this miracle victory, instead of saving the kingdom, push it one step closer to destruction? By the end of this video, you'll understand how a terminally ill king, barely old enough to rule, used a radical tactical formation to pull off the impossible. Why Saladin's own chroniclers carefully avoided describing what truly happened, and how this triumph planted the seeds of the Crusader Kingdom's downfall just years later. The truth includes a secret tactic known as the Iron Hedgehog, a controversial order to empty castle garrisons, and a brutal economic strategy that Saladin would use to suffocate Jerusalem 5 years after this very battle. But before all of that, you must understand the fuse that was about to ignite the entire region. To grasp how this unlikely victory occurred, we need to return to the scorching summer when a single broken agreement threatened to set the whole Levant ablaze. The year 1180 brought a weary calm to the Holy Land. A fragile truce between the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem and the steadily growing Ayyubid Empire gave both sides a rare moment to breathe. Baldwin IV, Jerusalem's leper king, ruled from his capital even as his own body betrayed him. At 19, he had already stunned enemies with his tactical genius, but the disease advanced faster than his kingdom's strength. Opposite him stood Saladin, the conqueror whose mercy was legendary, but whose ambition was absolute. He had united Syria and Egypt under one banner, ending decades of infighting among Muslim rulers. His purpose was clear, his goal unmistakable, the reconquest of Jerusalem. Yet the chronicles often conceal the true spark that reignited war. It wasn't faith or ideology. It was greed. Reynold de Chatillon, the infamous Mad Wolf of Carrick, controlled the crucial trade roads linking Damascus and Egypt from his nearly unassailable fortress. The caravans glittering with wealth passing beneath his walls proved too tempting. Late in 1181, Reynold struck a massive caravan bound from Damascus to Mecca. Among its travelers was Saladin's own sister. The plunder reached an astonishing 200,000 dinars. When Saladin demanded reparations and the release of prisoners, Reynold mocked him. "Let your Muhammad come to free them," he sneered, according to tradition. That insult shattered the truce. Saladin called the banners. Jihad was proclaimed. Fighters streamed in from across his dominions. By May of 1182, a force of roughly 30,000 gathered in Damascus. Mounted archers, volunteer warriors, elite Mamluks, and disciplined cavalry. The kingdom of Jerusalem teetered on the edge of ruin. Baldwin could field perhaps 1,200 knights across the entire realm. Many guarded remote fortresses spread from modern Lebanon to the Red Sea. The kingdom's strength lay in those castles, but that strength was also a fatal weakness. If you defended everywhere, you were strong nowhere. Then Baldwin ordered something no Crusader king had dared. Strip the fortresses, leave only skeleton garrisons. Gather every fighting man into one single field army. Genius or suicide? As Saladin's host swept southward, Baldwin's desperate gamble took shape. To truly grasp the terror they faced, imagine what 30,000 marching soldiers look like. In a column, they would stretch for more than 15 miles. Their daily food needs equaled those of a thriving town. Even from 20 miles away, the dust rising from their approach darkened the horizon. At the core of Saladin's army rode 12,000 mounted archers, Turks and Kurds, able to unleash storms of arrows at full gallop. Behind them followed 8,000 regular cavalry with lance and sword, and 10,000 more consisting of infantry, engineers, and zealous volunteers seeking martyrdom in paradise. At their peak, these archers could rain 30,000 arrows in a single minute. The logistics of such an army remain one of the marvels of medieval warfare. Against this tidal wave, Baldwin mustered his 750 knights and roughly 4,000 infantry scraped from every remaining garrison. But these men were no ordinary troops. A knight represented years of training and armor worth the value of an entire village. Even the infantry, though common-born, were veterans, men tempered by years of border warfare. Baldwin himself could barely climb into the saddle. Chroniclers describe attendants lifting him onto his horse, his decaying hands wrapped in silk so the troops wouldn't see the extent of his suffering. Yet his mind remained diamond-sharp. Beside him rode Raymond III of Tripoli, the kingdom's most seasoned commander, who had warned him not to abandon the castle garrisons. Lose the villages if you must, but never risk the kingdom, he had urged. But Baldwin had chosen his battleground wisely. Belvoir Castle, perched above the Jordan Valley, commanded the main road linking Damascus and Jerusalem. Its bright limestone walls loomed 500 feet above the plains. Saladin couldn't bypass it without exposing his supply line to attack. Then came his psychological war. Saladin's cavalry stormed through the valley, putting Christian villages to the torch one by one. From Belvoir's battlements, Crusader soldiers watched the countryside burn, columns of smoke twisting into the sky. Every ruined farm meant lost taxes, fewer recruits, and dwindling provisions. It was economic warfare of the harshest kind. Muslim chroniclers gloss over this devastation, but Crusader records preserve the nightmare. 60 villages wiped out in 3 days. Families fled to Belvoir's gates. The kingdom bled slowly and painfully as its lifeblood turned to ash. But Saladin miscalculated. By focusing on economic destruction, he granted Baldwin the time he desperately needed. As Muslim raiders burned the valley, Baldwin's army was doing something unheard of. Infantry and cavalry were drilling together in a completely new formation, one that would rewrite the rules of medieval strategy. Even today, historians struggle to understand how they developed it so quickly. It was called the Iron Hedgehog, Fiscus Ariacus in the Latin sources, and it represented a radical new vision of how knights and foot soldiers could fight as a single, unstoppable machine. As the first light of dawn spilled over the pale limestone of Belvoir, two armies stood poised to unleash a battle that would alter the very language of medieval warfare. Morning at Belvoir was not just another sunrise. It was the birth of an entirely new battlefield doctrine. As the rising sun brushed the castle walls with gold, Baldwin's small, but disciplined host marched down from the heights in a formation no scout had ever reported before. What Saladin's observers witnessed made no sense. Instead of the chaotic mix of charging knights and trailing infantry typical of Crusader tactics, the entire army glided as a single, perfectly aligned creature. 750 knights formed the core and rear of the force, while 4,000 infantry shaped a solid iron casing around them. But this was no simple shield wall. It bristled with 14-foot pikes like the quills of some immense steel beast. Crossbowmen filled every gap between the spearmen, and the knights waited behind them like compressed thunder, ready to burst forward through designated lanes carved into the formation. Then the sky turned black. 12,000 arrows arched downward as Turkish horse archers began their opening volley. Their strategy was the same one that had shattered armies from Syria to Anatolia: rain death from a distance, never allowing the enemy close. But this time, physics betrayed them. At Baldwin's command, the Crusader ranks lifted their shields in a single synchronized movement, forming an overlapping carapace. Arrows meant to pierce mail at 50 yards lost most of their killing power at the 200-yard distance favored by mounted archers. Moments later, the earth trembled. 8,000 Muslim cavalry thundered forward for the first probing strike. Their commander, Emir Muzaffar al-Din, who had crushed Christian armies from Spain to the Levant, searched the line for fear, for hesitation, for that single fatal crack. Then the vanguard hit. 500 elite Mamluks slammed into the Crusader front at full charge. Horses screamed, pikes snapped, the infantry line bowed backward like a drawn bowstring, but did not break. Instead, it absorbed the shock, giving just enough to survive the collision. And when the Mamluks pulled back to regroup, the Crusaders delivered a reply that turned the tide. A storm of crossbow bolts erupted from the formation. At 50 yards, a crossbow bolt could punch through mail as if it were cloth. In half a minute, 80 of Islam's finest cavalrymen lay sprawled on the field, dead or dying. But at that precise moment of advantage, disaster struck the Crusaders. Baldwin collapsed mid-command. The disease, ravaging his body, chose that instant to seize him. Witnesses later described attendants catching the king before he struck the ground. Yet even from the litter where they placed him, the dying monarch continued to command, whispering, "Hold the line. Let them come to us." And so the cycle continued: charge, recoil, crossbow volley, casualties mounting. Each time the infantry bent, each time they straightened. Yet what happened next would echo throughout centuries of military study. Frustrated, Turkish officers ordered their signature maneuver, the feigned retreat. 500 cavalry charged, clashed briefly, then turned and fled, expecting the usual response: young knights drunk on adrenaline-giving chase, only to be enveloped by horse archers and cut down in a deadly whirl of arrows. It had worked 100 times before, but this time, not a single knight moved. Not one. The Crusader formation stood immovable, their discipline carved from desperation. It stunned the Muslim riders. The irresistible lure of the feigned retreat had simply failed. From his vantage point on a nearby hill, Saladin watched in growing frustration. He counted the Crusader dead, examined their cohesion, measured every wobble in their formation. His calculations were exact. Standard tactics were useless. The Iron Hedgehog was repelling everything he threw at it. Then Baldwin did something no Crusader commander had ever dared. He ordered the entire formation to advance. Not to charge, to advance. A slow, synchronized march, the Iron Hedgehog gliding forward across the plain like a moving fortress. Imagine the sound. The synchronized crash of nearly 5,000 armored feet, pikes shimmering like a steel forest catching the newborn sun. The psychological impact on Saladin's cavalry, masters of maneuver and mobility, was crushing. Then Saladin issued the command that unleashed the storm. Full assault, all cavalry divisions. 8,000 horsemen surged forward in the largest single cavalry charge of the entire Crusader era. Witnesses inside Belvoir later claimed they felt the castle tremble from the force. Dust billowed 100 feet into the air. Steel clashed, horses roared, and the Crusader line vanished under a churning sea of hooves and blades. But then came the moment that military historians still struggle to believe. The Iron Hedgehog didn't break, it flexed. Where cavalry slammed into one section, that part of the line bent backward, while the flanking sections folded inward like jaws closing around prey. The attackers were funneled into narrow channels, crushed together so tightly they could barely maneuver. Crossbow bolts poured into them from 3 directions, turning the confined riders into trap targets. At such close quarters, the results were catastrophic. A Templar later wrote, "The Saracens fell like wheat beneath the scythe. Their glorious cavalry died pressed against our pikes, unable to advance or to flee. Within 20 minutes, 400 cavalrymen lay dead or horribly wounded." At that rate, Saladin would lose his entire mounted force long before the formation even weakened. The wave broke and rolled back, leaving the plain littered with bodies and shattered gear. But Saladin did not consider retreat. He was learning, adapting, calculating. The next assault combined every trick in the Turkish arsenal. 2,000 light cavalry attacked in rapid waves. Each time they made brief contact, they flipped away into a feigned retreat. Horse archers darted in, loosing 6 arrows in seconds, then veering off again. They struck from angles, from the flanks, from the rear, always trying to provoke one reckless break in formation. But something astonishing happened. The Crusader infantry shot back. Hidden among the spearmen were Genoese crossbowmen, Europe's most feared marksmen. As mounted archers galloped past, assuming speed made them untouchable, crossbow bolts found the gaps in their lighter armor. Baldwin, barely conscious but mentally unbroken, had dispersed his missile troops throughout the formation instead of clustering them. That single decision meant every segment of the Iron Hedgehog could defend itself against hit-and-run attacks. The feigned retreats grew more frantic. Groups of 50, then 100 cavalry would dash in, pull away at the last moment, then try to bait the knights. Young Crusaders clenched their reins so tightly their knuckles turned white. Yet none broke ranks. By the time this phase ended, the statistics were staggering. Crusader crossbowmen had fired more than 8,000 bolts. Each one represented a potential kill, and the line, against all logic, still held. Muslim losses mounted with every passing minute, while Crusader casualties remained astonishingly low. The Iron Hedgehog was draining Saladin's army like a wound that refused to close. Yet the true struggle was only just beginning. Infuriated by the failure of repeated cavalry assaults, Muslim commanders sent their infantry forward, reinforced by dismounted nobles and elite fighters. What followed was the kind of brutal, suffocating melee the outnumbered Crusaders could least afford. The line erupted into 100 desperate duels. A hospitaller sergeant fought on with 3 arrows lodged in his mail. A Muslim emir died hacking his way toward Baldwin's banner, cut down by a nameless foot soldier whose identity would never survive the centuries. Latin chronicles preserve fragments of heroism. Brother William, who held a breach alone for precious minutes. Sergeant Garcia, who cut down 6 attackers before collapsing. Then the Crusaders revealed the final secret of their formation. The Iron Hedgehog could not only endure an attack, it could launch one. At a horn's blast, sections of the pike wall suddenly parted. Through these openings surged mounted knights in tight wedge formations, smashing into the disorganized Muslim infantry still reeling from their failed assault. The timing was flawless. Packed foot soldiers, pressed against the pikes, couldn't form ranks before the knights tore through them like blades through cloth. After carving bloody lanes through the crush of bodies, the knights wheeled back and slipped through the very gaps from which they'd emerged. Behind them, the infantry wall closed tight, as seamless as water. 400 more Muslim fighters lay dead in just 5 minutes. But Saladin had seen this trick years earlier at Montgassard when a young Baldwin used a similar tactic to shatter his army. The Sultan prepared his counterstroke, one that would change medieval warfare in less than a minute. Every archer, maximum fire. Saladin's order unleashed an inferno. 12,000 mounted archers began circling the Crusader formation, each man loosing arrows as quickly as he could draw. The sky turned into a storm of steel, 30,000 arrows a minute, a rain so dense it darkened the sun. The Crusader formation tucked inward, shields raised, transforming into a massive turtle shell of interlocking defenses. By the end of the volley, their shields looked like bristling porcupines quivering under the weight of embedded shafts. But even courage has limits. There were always gaps. Necks, thighs, sword arms, faces. Men began to drop, some silently, others with prayers on their lips. A knight who survived later wrote, "The arrows fell like winter hail. The sun vanished. My shield carried 18 shafts when it ended. I thought the last day had come." Yet even here, the Crusaders had prepared. Pavis shields, huge rectangular barriers normally used during sieges, were dispersed through the formation. Behind them, wounded men were dragged to safety, and crossbowmen crouched to reload in relative protection. What Saladin saw next shook him. Despite the storm, despite the mounting wounds, despite the fear and exhaustion, the Iron Hedgehog continued to push forward step by relentless step. It left a trail of dead behind it, but the formation never opened, never faltered. The psychological effect on Muslim morale was devastating. Then came the order that stunned both armies. Saladin, calculating casualties and morale with the precision of a master strategist, realized the truth. His forces had suffered nearly 2,000 dead, while the Crusaders had lost only about 180. It was a slaughter, not a battle. The exchange rate alone was ruinous. His men, victors from Egypt to Syria, were being systematically butchered by a force they outnumbered 40-1. Signal the withdrawal, Saladin commanded at last. His emirs protested. They still dwarfed the Crusaders in numbers. But Saladin saw what they refused to admit. Yes, the Iron Hedgehog could be broken, but not without sacrificing half his army. What victory was worth 10,000 dead? The withdrawal was magnificent, controlled, methodical, honorable. Muslim cavalry pulled back in disciplined waves, firing arrows to prevent pursuit. Infantry shifted into rearguard positions. The great baggage train retreated without chaos. And as the horns sounded across the plain, the Crusaders realized they had achieved the impossible. But victory came with a hidden cost, one that would destroy them. At the very moment triumph shimmered on the horizon, Baldwin issued a final order. Hold position, no pursuit. The exhausted Crusaders watched their enemies melt away into the distance. They had no energy left for cheers. Knights slumped to the ground where they stood. Infantry leaned heavily on blood-slick pikes. The Iron Hedgehog dissolved into a mass of staggering, wounded men. The immediate toll was staggering. 2,000 Muslim dead lay across the battlefield. Mamluks, cavalrymen, volunteers, emirs. The Crusaders counted 180 fallen and around 400 wounded. By medieval standards, these numbers were unbelievable. Such lopsided battles usually existed only in embellished chronicles, but this one had happened in broad daylight. Baldwin had to be carried off the field, his body surrendering at last to exhaustion and disease. Raymond of Tripoli, bleeding from a deep wound on his scalp, oversaw the grim task of gathering the wounded. When the final count was made, the entire Crusader field army had fewer than 500 men still capable of fighting. And the deeper cost of the day revealed itself by evening. Yes, they had won a miracle, but the kingdom had been gutted. Saladin's strategy of economic devastation had worked with brutal precision. 60 villages were nothing but smoldering ruins. The kingdom's tax base for the coming year was annihilated. No harvest meant no revenue, no money to hire mercenaries, repair defenses, or maintain the castle network that held the realm together. Worse, the battle had produced almost no high-ranking prisoners. Muslim nobles had fought to the death rather than surrender to an army so vastly outnumbered. Crusader knights who fell were cut down instantly. There would be no ransoms, no political leverage, no financial relief. That night, the Crusader camp was shrouded in silence. Men prayed not just in gratitude for surviving, but in dread for the future. Saladin still commanded 28,000 warriors just 3 miles away. The Crusaders could not endure another such battle. And yet, in winning today, they had ensured their destruction tomorrow. The victory at Belvoir exposed the kingdom's fatal flaw. Baldwin had proved that when Crusader forces concentrated, they could defeat armies many times their size. But concentration meant stripping every garrison, leaving vast territories undefended, wide open to the very raids Saladin excelled at. Here was the birth of true medieval economic warfare. Saladin had identified the kingdom's Achilles heel. It didn't matter how many battles the Crusaders won if their economic system collapsed beneath them. The 60 destroyed villages represented the livelihood of nearly 100,000 peasants, an economic loss equal to maintaining 500 knights for an entire year. The path to Hattin was carved here. Saladin would never again seek a pitched battle against the full Crusader host. Instead, he would force them to divide, raiding here, besieging there, burning farms, threatening caravans, bleeding the kingdom with 1,000 tiny cuts. Modern historians view Belvoir as a prototype of asymmetric warfare. The weaker force won the battle through discipline and innovation, but lost the war because the stronger force controlled the long-term resources. Saladin could replace his losses. Baldwin could not. The Iron Hedgehog itself was one of the greatest tactical breakthroughs of the Middle Ages. Pike squares, integrated missile troops, and rapid cavalry counterattacks blended centuries ahead of their time. But such a formation required discipline and training the Crusader States could never sustain. 5 years later, at Hattin, Saladin applied every lesson he'd learned. He forced the Crusaders away from water, exhausted them with harassment, and attacked only when they staggered out of formation. The kingdom that had seemed invincible at Belvoir collapsed in one terrible afternoon. Think about what this means for military history. Sometimes winning every battle guarantees losing the war. The brilliance at Belvoir taught their enemy the strategy that destroyed them. Victory contained the seed of ultimate defeat. Baldwin IV, the king who defied 30,000 warriors, won a glorious triumph that echoed across centuries, yet doomed his kingdom within 5 years. He died in 1185, consumed at last by the disease that never conquered his spirit. He never lived to see how his greatest victory led, inevitably, to Christianity's fall from Jerusalem. The age of chivalric warfare ended on the slopes of Belvoir. In its place rose a colder truth, economics over heroism, attrition over valor, strategy over bravery. Saladin learned that the Iron Hedgehog could not be shattered by force. It had to be starved. And in 1187, he did exactly that.